So before I get into this episode, I wanted to take a second to say thank you. Um, I've noticed a lot more people coming to the channel in the past week or so than I really ever anticipated or expected. Um, and the comments have been genuinely very fun to interact with and mostly very kind. And that's been very, very fun. This has always been a space where I talk about games and things that really meant something to me. So to see other people interacting with it in similar ways has been really motivating. Seriously, if you've subscribed, commented, watched, anything like that, thank you sincerely. Now, let's talk about Spore.
I want to take this time to introduce you to one of our most recent creations.
So when people talk about Spore, they're usually talking about the ambition of the game or the creature editor or all the different phases that you go through. And this promise where you could guide a species from its very first moments as like a single cellular life form all the way out to being a starfaring civilization. Usually though they do talk about the creature editor. But very rarely do I ever hear anyone talking about the music. And that's interesting because the soundtrack is doing an enormous amount of work while you're playing the game. The thing is, it just does that work very quietly. Spore is a game that refuses to let you stay still. Every time you get comfortable, the rules change. You start microscopic, it's really barely alive, just floating through this primordial soup. And then suddenly you're walking on land and you're interacting with other creatures in kind of primal ways. Then you start building tribes and cities and full civilizations. And then you become a full-fledged spacefaring empire. That kind of constant escalation in gameplay is really hard to write music for. Most games are built around like a core fantasy or at least core visual theme. They're also built around a single tone that can reinforce that theme over and over throughout the course of the game. But Spore doesn't have that luxury because of how much it changes. And instead of trying to force a through line with the music, the soundtrack takes a different approach entirely. The soundtrack itself changes and adapts to your choices just as much as the game does. So before we really get too far into Spore's soundtrack, we need to talk about Brian Eno, because his involvement sort of explains why the soundtrack feels the way it does. Brian Eno is one of the most influential musicians within the last 50 years. He helped pioneer ambient music, and he produced albums for artists like David Bowie and Talking Heads. And he helped shape thinking of music as an environment rather than a performance. Eno once described ambient music as something that should be as ignorable as it is interesting. Music that doesn't demand your attention, but changes the space that you're in. And that idea fits Spore perfectly. Instead of fixed tracks, much of Spore's music is procedural. It shifts and assembles itself based on what you're doing and where you are within the game. The soundtrack isn't telling you what to feel, it's just existing with you. Brian Eno wasn't brought onto the game to score a specific feeling or specific moments. He was brought on to help build a musical system that could grow with the player and their civilization. Um, Rather than writing traditional tracks with clear motifs and beginnings and endings, the music in Spore behaves more like its own system. Layers fade in and out, textures will shift subtly to change the mood, and motifs will come and go depending on what's going on in the game. The music seems to react to what's happening, but it never pulls your attention away. It feels less like something that you are actively listening to and more like something that's growing along with you, which of course makes sense because Spore is about growth. In the cellular stage, the music is very sparse and almost like tentative. There's curiosity, there's also a lot of like restraint and unsureness. I don't know if that's a word. Nothing feels dramatic or triumphant because you aren't dramatic or triumphant. You're not special yet. You're just alive. Same with the music. At this point in the game, the rules are very like ambiguous. You're experimenting and reacting to things as they come at you, and you're figuring out how things work by trial and error. And the music gives you plenty of space to do that. It doesn't rush you, it doesn't tell you how you should feel. It simply exists alongside you in the moment. As you move into the creature stage, the music becomes almost warmer. There's more rhythms and there's movement within the sounds itself, but it still never crosses over into actual like song territory. Even when you're fighting or communicating with other creatures, the music doesn't frame those moments as heroic or villainous, and that's kind of important because Spore never tells you what kind of species you're supposed to be. All the choices about how you grow and what you do are yours, and the music doesn't try to frame it in one way or another. By the time we reach the tribal and civilization stages, the world starts to feel structured. There are clearer goals, more systems involved, and like general feedback from the game. But the soundtrack is still kind of restrained at this point. It doesn't celebrate expansion or glorify conquest. Instead, it maintains a sense of distance. Like the world is observing you rather than cheering you on. And that choice keeps the game from slipping into like a power fantasy territory. You're progressing, but you're not being told whether or not the progress is good or bad through musical cues. The space stage is where the soundtrack really starts to shine, honestly. This is where a lot of other games would lean hard into grandeur with big sweeping melodies and epic crescendos. But Spore is not like other games. Instead, space feels quiet, vast, and a little lonely. You've come so far, and yet the universe feels no closer to understanding you. That quiet in the visuals and the gameplay and the music itself reinforces some of the core ideas of Spore. No matter how advanced you become, you're still very small. I think one of the reasons that this soundtrack works so well is because it understands restraint. It understands that not every moment needs to be emotionally underlined with music. Not every action needs, auditory validation. The music doesn't tell you what matters. It lets you kind of decide that for yourself. The music is just along for the ride with you. People don't talk about Spore's soundtrack for obvious reasons. There's no hooks. There aren't really melodies that you can hum later, and there's not really tracks that announce themselves with a beginning and an end. The music blends into the experience so thoroughly that it almost disappears. But that is, of course, intentional. It's a soundtrack that knows when to take a step back. I think that's part of the reason why I struggled when deciding to make this video, because I didn't really know if there was a soundtrack to talk about. Obviously there's music in Spore, but it's not like SimCity 4 or Rock Raiders, where there are clear tracks with a beginning and an end and melodies that you can hum and remember for years. Instead, Spore's soundtrack feels like a traveling companion. It grows with you, and it doesn't judge anything that you do. It's there with you, sort of like the wind, or the sound of air through the trees, which is also still just wind. Let's get another example. It's also like water. There we go. I figured it out. Let's be honest, Spore is an imperfect game. It is messy, overambitious, and uneven. But its soundtrack knows exactly what the game is trying to be. It doesn't impose meaning upon you, it just supports whatever you decide to do. And sometimes the most effective soundtrack is not one that you remember clearly for years. It's the kind that makes the world feel real.